Socratic opposition. This arrest was illegal, and Leon would almost certainly have been murdered as soon as he was brought to Athens. Regardless of the consequences, Socrates ignored his illegal orders and simply returned home. This decision would probably have cost Socrates his life, but for a series of unforeseen developments. Critias was killed, and shortly afterward the 30 tyrants were deposed. The tyrants were replaced by democrats, who in turn also had it in for Socrates. But in order to heal the wounds of the civil war, a general amnesty was declared, and Socrates was safe. Or so it appeared. In 399 BC, he was arrested on charges of impiety and corruption of the young. The man behind these charges was a leading democrat named Anytus, who held a long-standing grudge against Socrates. Several years earlier, Anytus's son had become a pupil of Socrates and had soon been persuaded by his teacher that he was better off living the philosophical life than going into the family tanning business. The charges against Socrates were an obvious sham, but they involved the death penalty. This seems a bit excessive. Socrates was certainly unpopular, like any intellectual who argues for unpopular causes on grounds of principle, but the death penalty, for a 70-year-old man? There remains a certain mystery about these charges and the consequent proceedings, and it seems unlikely they will ever be fully explained. I say mystery rather than secret, for it seems pretty obvious that everyone in Athens knew what the affair was really about. Socrates stood trial before the 500 members of the ruling council, each chosen at random from among the free men of Athens. The case against Socrates was brought by Miletus, who was merely a front man for Anytus. Miletus was an unsuccessful, young, tragic poet with long hair, a thin beard, and a beaky nose. He had a cutting, sarcastic way with words, a suitable adversary for the wily old Socrates. Miletus put the case for the prosecution, ending with a demand for the death penalty. It was now up to the accused to defend himself. Here, Socrates seems to have misjudged the seriousness of the situation, and he began treating the court as if it were taking part in one of his philosophical conversation classes. Some of the council were amused, but many were not. In the end, the vote went against Socrates, 280 to 220 in favor of the death penalty. It was now up to Socrates to put forward a counter-proposal for a lesser sentence. Still, he refused to take the trial seriously. The charges against him were ludicrous, and he knew it. Socrates suggested that instead of being punished, he should in fact be honored for all he had done for the city. Instead of the death penalty, he should be granted a place at the Prytaneum, the sacred hall where Athenian heroes were given free board at the public expense. Uproar in court. Acknowledging this outrage, Socrates demurred. He proposed that instead he should pay a fine, one commensurate with what he could afford. He suggested the derisory sum of 1 mina, enough to buy a pitcher of wine. Further uproar. Socrates' friends were now begging him to come to his senses. Reluctantly, Socrates proposed that instead of the death penalty, he should be fined 30 mina. By now the council had had enough. This time they returned a verdict of 360 to 140 in favor of the death penalty. There is more than a hint of pig-headedness in Socrates' attitude to all this. Did he seriously believe the court would recognize his worth and release him, or was he determined to die? Had he suggested a sentence of exile, the court would certainly have agreed, and Socrates would have been comfortably supported in exile by his friends. It would appear that Socrates harbored a desire for martyrdom, if only subconsciously. Socrates should have been taken from the court and his sentence carried out forthwith, but on the day before the trial, the sacred galley had set out on its annual voyage to the island of Delos, more than 100 miles away across the Aegean. No executions were permitted until its return, so Socrates was manacled and taken to the state prison. The precise outlines of this prison may still be seen 100 yards southwest of the present ruins of the Agora, amidst a patch of uneven waste ground littered with ancient stones and old foundations. The cell and inner bathhouse where Socrates was confined are directly on the right as one enters. and it was here that he received his friends during his last days. On this insignificant piece of earth, 6 paces by 6 paces, occurred the scenes described by Plato in his finest dialogues, masterpieces of ancient Greek literature worthy of comparison to Homer and the tragedies. The hero of these dialogues remains himself throughout, utterly human, wise, and infuriatingly admirable, much as one imagines he intended. At one stage his friend Crito explains that he has hatched a plot for his escape, bribing the guards to turn a blind eye. But Socrates will have none of this. It would be contrary to everything he stands for. Socrates believed steadfastly in the rule of law, even when it was wrong. Finally, news arrives that the sacred galley has been sighted rounding Cape Sunion. It will soon be in Athens. Socrates' friends and his wife, Xantippe, gather in his cell. Socrates then sends Xantippe away because he wants no upsetting displays of emotion. As she leaves, Xantippe protests, "But you're innocent." Characteristically, Socrates replies, "Would you rather I was guilty?" Socrates discusses with his friends, disciples would be a more apt description at this juncture, the nature of death and immortality. This is rendered in deeply moving detail by Plato, even though he was not there. On this, of all days, Plato was confined to bed with a fever. Then Socrates is handed the bowl containing the hemlock. Athens operated a do-it-yourself execution policy. True to the end, Socrates pleads ignorance, asking, "What is the proper way to do this?" "Just drink it down," replies the servant. "Then walk about until your legs feel weak. After that, lie down and the poison will do the rest." "Am I allowed to pour a libation to the gods?" "No, don't spill any, or there may not be enough for the poison to work properly." Socrates downs the bowl in one draught. His friends are no longer able to disguise their grief and begin weeping uncontrollably. Socrates admonishes them. "Pull yourselves together. Didn't I send Xantippe away to avoid this kind of scene?" He lies down, and slowly the numbness creeps up his body. "Remember, Crito, I owe a cock to Asclepius," are his final words. Then the gadfly of Athens is dead. Socrates' last words, as recorded by Plato, have the ring of authenticity, not least because it is not precisely clear what they mean. Here we can be fairly certain that truth triumphed over literature, even if Plato did have to rely on the hearsay of his friends. Inevitably, Socrates' last words have been subjected to various explanations. The most obvious is that Socrates simply owed a chicken to a friend named Asclepius, and wished to pay off his debt. But this is far too banal for many scholars. Asclepius, besides being a fairly common name, was also the god of medicine and healing. He was usually depicted walking with a staff entwined with a snake, the origin of the emblem that adorns pharmacies and ambulances to this day. Some suggest that Socrates' last words mean that he wanted his doctor's bill paid off. Others have put forward a more ingenious metaphysical explanation. An alternative translation of Socrates' last words reads, "Crito, we ought to sacrifice a cock to Asclepius. See to it, and don't forget." Asclepius's powers were said to include the ability to heal one's soul of the ills of this world in preparation for the next, so Socrates' gift of a chicken may well have been in the hope of a safe passage for his soul to the next world. This would be in line with his belief in the immortality of the soul. As Socrates explained to his gathered friends before he drank the hemlock, only those who have lived an evil life hope that death is the end of everything for them. This is perfectly reasonable, for it is in their interests that it should be so. However, I am convinced that the souls of the wicked wander desolately through the lower world of Tartarus. Only those who have lived good lives will be admitted to the real world. Socrates was man enough, and philosopher enough, to admit an element of uncertainty on this point. Before drinking the hemlock, he announced to his friends, "We go our separate ways, I to die, and you to live. Which one is better, God alone knows." Within days of Socrates' death, the people of Athens realized the enormity of what they had done. A period of mourning for Socrates was declared. Gymnasia, theatres, and schools were closed. Miletus was condemned to death, and Anytus was banished. Later, a bronze statue of Socrates by Lysippus was erected on the Sacred Way, somewhere for the unemployed to gather beneath their noblest protagonist. This is all very honourable, and would appear to reflect well on the citizens of Athens, but to me it suggests that Socrates was merely a pawn in some deeper political contest. In the overall game, Socrates, as usual, won hands down, or we wouldn't be reading about him today. Afterward. The elusive Socrates. We know about Socrates from two main sources, Plato and Xenophon, both of whom were pupils of Socrates. Plato went on to become a philosopher, recording his philosophy in his masterly dialogues, a large number of which feature Socrates. Xenophon, on the other hand, became a soldier whose military career was such a disaster that he turned to writing instead. One of his best-known works is his Memorabilia, which describes Socrates. Unfortunately, these two first-hand sources present us with two different pictures of Socrates, which only occasionally overlap. Xenophon was conservative by nature, and was outraged that his old teacher should be accused of corrupting the youth of Athens. His defensive portrayal of Socrates contains a wealth of anecdotal detail, but very little actual philosophy. Indeed, sometimes Socrates scarcely appears to be a philosopher at all. In one of Xenophon's dialogues, Economicus, Socrates turns up as a character, but is mainly concerned with offering advice on how to look after a garden. And often in Xenophon's Memorabilia, Socrates' ideas are so boring and unoriginal that it is difficult to see what all the fuss over him was about. Such a man should certainly never have been prosecuted for preaching subversive ideas, but such a man was also never a great philosopher. Xenophon may have been too dim to absorb Socrates' ideas, but he also gives the impression of being too dim to present an imaginative picture of Socrates that wasn't true. For this reason, many have been inclined to accept Xenophon's picture of Socrates. Bertrand Russell firmly disposes of this attitude. A stupid man's report of what a clever man says is never accurate, because he unconsciously translates what he hears into something that he can understand. Conversely, Plato's rendering of Socrates may have been too clever by half. The Socrates who emerges from Plato's dialogues is a masterfully drawn literary portrait. Here is a superb character, but very much a work of art, prompting suspicion that it may well be an improvement on the original man. An improvement with artistic rather than moral intent. Plato's Socrates is no saint. Likewise, there is the difficulty of separating what Socrates actually said from what Plato wanted him to say. We know that Plato put much of his own philosophy into Socrates' mouth, but how much? The picture of Socrates I have drawn is taken from both these sources. Where they overlap, one sometimes catches a glimpse of an unmistakable but unpredictable character. This is the elusive man I have tried to capture. All are agreed that Socrates prided himself on a certain elusiveness both in his arguments and his personality. He may well have eluded us to this day. The legacy of Socrates. Socrates' heritage is an ambiguous one, as no doubt he would have wished it. His influence on Plato was profound, and as such has continued to permeate philosophy to this day. This ancient Greek legacy has been compared to garlic. Once it got into the dish, it was impossible to get it out. One taste of philosophy and its ancient Greek flavor continues to repeat itself, no matter what. Socrates' dialectic proved decisive. This conversational method almost certainly dictated the literary form of Plato's great dialogues, but its effect on philosophy is difficult to exaggerate. Socrates' method of analyzing a subject was the first significant use of reason for its own sake in philosophy. He would begin by asking his adversary to define the subject under discussion, which might be anything from the nature of justice to the method of becoming a general. Whether sublime or ridiculous, the subject was given the same treatment. This was the great innovation of the dialectic. It was a tool that could be applied to anything. Having elicited a definition of the subject, but for a series of unforeseen developments, Critias was killed, and shortly afterward the 30 tyrants were deposed. The tyrants were replaced by democrats, who in turn also had it in for Socrates. But in order to heal the wounds of the civil war, they involved the death penalty. This seems a bit excessive. Socrates was certainly unpopular, like any intellectual who argues for unpopular causes on grounds of principle, but the death penalty, for a 70-year-old man? There remains a certain mystery about these. Amnesty was declared, and Socrates was safe. Or so it appeared. In 399 BC, he was arrested on charges of impiety and corruption of the young. The man behind these charges was a leading Democrat named Anytus, who held a long-standing democratic opposition. This arrest was illegal, and Leon would almost certainly have been murdered as soon as he was brought to Athens. Regardless of the consequences, Socrates ignored his illegal orders and simply returned home. This decision would probably have cost Socrates his life. Charge against Socrates. Several years earlier, Anytus's son had become a pupil of Socrates and had soon been persuaded by his teacher that he was better off living the philosophical life than going into the family tanning business. The charges against Socrates were an obvious sham.